At 2:23 a.m., 3 Ukrainian FP-1 drones entered waters controlled by Russia. They were moving fast, around 180 kilometers per hour, heading straight toward a Russian reconnaissance ship operating near Novorossiysk, about 15 nautical miles off the coast. This vessel acted as Russia's eyes and ears at sea. For the past 6 weeks, it had been recording every signal and movement in the area to predict future Ukrainian attacks. Had nothing happened, it would have completed its threat map in just a few days. But tonight, everything changed. The 3 FP-1 drones were flying very low, skimming just 3 meters above the waves. Their bodies were made of plywood, rendering them nearly invisible to radar. Russian radar systems are optimized to detect metal objects, allowing the 3 drones to slip by unnoticed. Roughly 20 minutes after launch, a Russian forepost or reconnaissance aircraft appeared on the horizon, patrolling 30 kilometers off the Ukrainian coast. This aircraft was equipped with a high-performance camera, the MX-15DI, built in Canada. It could detect a basketball-sized object from 5 kilometers away and register temperature differences as small as 2 degrees Celsius. At 2:45, the camera feed showed 3 small heat signatures moving eastward at high speed. The heat from the engine of the lead FP-1 had made it visible. Russian operators zoomed in, trying to identify the object. But at that exact moment, the FP-1's automatic radar avoidance program activated. All 3 drones dropped their altitude to just 2 meters above sea level, hiding themselves in sea clutter, the area where radar becomes confused by water surface reflections. Thanks to their wooden frames, the drones quickly cooled to match the sea's temperature, making them completely vanish from thermal cameras. Russian operators assumed they were just low-flying birds and dismissed the alert. Meanwhile, Ukraine's urgency in launching the drones became clear. Just minutes after the FP-1s left their launch platform, a Russian strike aircraft located the site and dropped a 50 kilograms warhead, destroying all remaining equipment. The Ukrainian operators managed to evacuate in time, but the entire control station was reduced to scrap metal. On board the Russian reconnaissance vessel, warning systems finally activated, but was too late. By 3:30 a.m., while the 3 FP-1s were still crossing the Black Sea, Ukraine launched 20 additional naval drones towards Sevastopol, each traveling at roughly 80 kilometers per hour. But here's the twist: most of these were decoys. Many were actually jet skis outfitted with cheap controllers and sensors or modified small civilian boats. Each cost less than $10,000, but they were programmed to perfectly mimic real Magura V. 5 drones on radar, same speed, same radar signature, same formation. Looking at their screens, Russian operators believed they were under attack by the largest drone swarm since October 2022. What they didn't realize was that the majority of this incoming army were low-cost decoys, skillfully controlled to confuse and overload the defense network. The 3 Ukrainian FP-1 drones weren't just flying erratically. They were programmed to attack like the real thing, splitting formation, faking convergences on targets, then scattering again, even performing evasive maneuvers against radar or gunfire. For the first 50 kilometers, they were remotely controlled via satellite uplink. After that, they switched to autonomous mode, operating entirely on their own. Each drone broadcasted radio signals on frequencies Ukraine knew Russia was actively monitoring, part of the plan to deceive. Some even carried fake heat sources, making them appear on thermal cameras just like heavily armed strike drones. The operation had to be flawless. Even a single hint of suspicion from a Russian side, and the entire mission would collapse. Russia had 6 Ka-27 PL anti-submarine helicopters stationed at Novorossiysk and 4 more in Sevastopol. These were the main counter-drone force of the Black Sea Fleet. Warships were too slow, and fighter jets couldn't hover in place to search for moving sea targets. Only helicopters were flexible enough. They could sweep 100 square kilometers in 20 minutes, drop RGB-16 depth charges to destroy anything within a 50-meter radius, and deploy sonar buoys to hunt underwater drones. Without them, the waters around Novorossiysk were virtually undefended. According to Russian combat protocol, any threat that appears first must be dealt with immediately. And just as Ukraine had predicted, all 6 helicopters from Novorossiysk took off instantly, flying westward at 270 kilometers per hour, directly toward the decoy drone swarm. The sound of rotors echoed, then faded into the distance. And with every minute they flew west, the real FP-1 drones were flying east, unopposed. By the time the Russians realized they had been fooled, it was far too late. The helicopters were now 360 kilometers away from the asset they were supposed to protect. The Russian reconnaissance ship, stationed 15 nautical miles off the coast, was now completely isolated. No air cover, no rapid response, and no way to call back the helicopters to investigate suspicious signals. For the next 2 hours, any drone that made it past the patrol perimeter would have a clear shot at the vessel. The 3 real FP-1s then suddenly adjusted course, a calculated 15-degree shift northward. Ukrainian planners had discovered that Russia was using 2 Podlet K-1 radar stations to monitor this sector. Each radar rotated 10 times per minute, like 2 sweeping lighthouse beams. And for 4 seconds out of every minute, both radar sweeps were angled away from the same direction, creating a 2-kilometer wide blind corridor that drones could slip through undetected. However, Russia had already identified this weakness and began randomizing radar sweep speeds to eliminate fixed blind spots. The safe corridor was slowly shrinking. The first drone entered the area at 4:47 a.m. On Russian radar, it appeared for just 2 seconds, then vanished for 4, exactly as predicted. Operators saw a brief, fast-moving blip, but it wasn't enough data to classify. The second drone arrived 30 seconds later, maintaining its heading, still mostly invisible. But the third drone encountered problem. A minor fault in its gyroscope caused a drift of around 200 meters to the right, a tiny error that began to compound over time. At 4:48, Russian controllers received orders to alter radar sweep cycles, introducing random phase shifts to eliminate any blind corridors Ukraine might exploit. The third drone was forced to veer north, making a hard course correction to avoid detection, but this cost it valuable fuel. 1 minute later, at 4:49, it passed through a newly formed narrow corridor. Both radars locked on simultaneously. Contact detected, heading 270 degrees, speed 180 kilometers per hour, altitude 50 meters. However, at that exact moment, 20 other targets appeared on Sevastopol's radar screens. The operator, overwhelmed, assumed the lone blip was just another low-flying bird. He tagged it as unidentified and returned his focus to the decoy swarm off the coast. And just like that, the third drone slipped silently through the net. But that last-minute course correction had cost it over 12 minutes of flight time. As it approached its target zone, its onboard computer flashed a warning. Less than 60 seconds of fuel remaining, not enough to complete the mission unless everything was executed with precision. Meanwhile, the Russian reconnaissance ship calmly held position, anchored 15 nautical miles from Novorossiysk. It was protected by 2 Project 031-60 patrol vessels, circling within a 5-kilometer radius. This was part of Russia's strict new defense doctrine, implemented after the flagship Moskva was sunk. The recon ship's radar could see farther than the patrol vessels, spotting threats they couldn't, like a sweeper midfielder orchestrating the defense. At 5 a.m., Ukraine's decoy fleet launched its final act. As Russian helicopters entered combat range, 20 fake drones dispersed in all directions. Some crashed into empty beaches, some circled in place until they ran out of fuel and fell into the sea, and a few simply hovered, then stopped dead in the air. None of them attempted to approach the real target, because their mission wasn't to strike, it was to mislead. The Russian helicopters spent over an hour chasing down these leftovers, burning through nearly half their fuel and hundreds of rounds of ammo, all to destroy drones that cost less than a single torpedo. By the time they returned, they were nearly 180 kilometers away from Novorossiysk, with insufficient fuel to respond quickly if anything happened. And the real attack was still coming. At 6 o'clock, the lead FP-1 drone was about 240 kilometers from its target when its GPS signal began to drift eastward. The drone hadn't turned, it was being spoofed. Russia had activated its R-330ZZ jamming system from Crimea. It broadcast fake GPS signals millions of times stronger than the real ones, tricking the drone into thinking it was on course. In reality, the actual target lay to the west, while the drone was being lured east, straight toward a waiting Panzer artillery battery. But the Ukrainian controllers had anticipated this. Across the Black Sea, there are abandoned drilling platforms every 50 kilometers. The FP-1's camera could spot them from 5 kilometers away, using them as visual reference points to recalibrate its coordinates. The Mark I Mod 1 eyeball, human vision, was still the most reliable weapon. Thanks to that, the lead FP-1 held its heading, even as GPS tried to steer it off course. The second drone wasn't as lucky. At 6:15, its GPS receiver failed completely, not because of jamming, but due to a cheap capacitor overheating. Without GPS, it switched to inertial navigation, but the drift error increased by 10 meters per minute. Less than an hour later, it had veered more than 8 kilometers off course, lost in the early morning fog over the sea. At 6:45, the lead FP-1 touched the water. No explosion, just vanished. Only 2 drones remained. The third, trailing about 5 kilometers behind, still held a stable GPS lock, but not for long. The Russian recon ship began to act. Its mineral ME radar began scanning, and its SIGINT crew started hunting for electronic emissions. Every electronic device emits a spectral fingerprint, stray harmonics from resonating circuits, and that's exactly what they were trying to capture. At 7:23, they found a target. Heading 285 degrees, speed 180 kilometers per hour, range 15 kilometers. The radar locked on. The drone's threat recognition system also picked up a lock warning, but the drone's plywood body confused radars tuned for metallic reflections. Mineral ME's algorithms were looking for sharp aluminum echoes. The soft return from the wooden frame caused unstable echoes, making the radar lose lock repeatedly. The operator reported intermittent signal loss. The third FP-1 responded as programmed. Upon detecting radar lock, it shut down everything except its gyroscope and flew blind, guided only by compass. But its R-984UM jammer began overlapping with Russian ship comms, and every time it broadcast, it interfered with the Russian radar itself. 7:25, the Russian recon ship dispatched a patrol boat to investigate. It accelerated to 35 knots, its PKM machine gun loaded and ready. The gunner chambered around, adjusted sights, ready to take down a low-flying target within 500 meters, a drill they had practiced hundreds of times. But that was with metal drones, not plywood ones. The lead FP-1 had less than 3 minutes of fuel left. The third drone was closing in, invisible to radar, GPS offline, guided by only inertial sensors. This morning's fog was thick, visibility under 500 meters. Every decision now had to be made in seconds, among crashing waves, howling wind, and the hum of electronic static rising from the deep. 7:30, the lead FP-1 entered the target zone, about 15 nautical miles off Novorossiysk. The Russian reconnaissance ship remained exactly as predicted, coordinating with 2 patrol vessels on either side, like a shield of radar coverage. All 3 formed a tight protective network, at least in theory. Each Me-1 radar on the patrol ships scans a 120 degrees arc, able to detect a target as small as 0.1 square meters within a 15 kilometers range. Old Soviet doctrine placed unshakable faith in physics that radar would see everything. But the Black Sea this morning betrayed that faith. An inversion layer had formed, warm air trapped above cold air hugging the sea surface, causing radar waves to bend upward like light through a prism. It's not uncommon in September, when the sea still holds summer heat, but the morning air cools quickly. A temperature difference of just 10 degrees Celsius over 50 vertical meters is enough to create an atmospheric lens, throwing radar angles off by 15 degrees. That means what appears at 50 meters altitude on radar is actually flying at 80 meters in real life. And anything flying below 30 meters simply vanishes from the scan. The FP-1 was flying at just 3 meters altitude, practically a submarine with wings. 7:32, the lead drone entered radar range, but the Russian radar beam was scanning too high. It drifted silently beneath the detection cone, completely unnoticed, until the patrol boats saw it with the naked eye. Distance, 500 meters. The FP-1's camera captured the growing shape of the ship. 500 meters. Then a muzzle flash. 400 meters. The PKM gunfire echoed across the water, its tracer rounds skimming the waves. 3 rounds hit, punching through the drone's wooden frame. 1 clipped the propeller, shaking the motor violently, but not killing it. The drone wobbled, then banked out of the firing line. 90 seconds of fuel left. 7:33. The massive radar mast of the Russian recon ship emerged in the distance, now less than 1 kilometer away. but the damaged propeller had cracked the motor mount. The patrol boat immediately radioed. Drone incoming. Bearing 2A5. Damaged but still flying. On board the recon ship, sailors raised binoculars, scanning south as directed. A fatal mistake. They should have been looking northwest. And there, veiled and missed, the third FP. One drone stayed perfectly on course, guided by its aging gyroscope. It had no idea it was flying blind, and no idea that fate was now on its side. 7:34, the third FP. One broke through the morning fog, approaching from the port side of the Russian ship at 180 kilometers per hour, flying just 10 meters above the water. At the same moment, the lead drone's engine finally died. It slipped into the sea, ending its journey. Its mission was complete. It had drawn attention. Every eye aboard the Russian ship was focused on the drone that had just crashed, while the real threat was closing in, completely unnoticed. The ship's navigation radar couldn't skim below -5 degrees because no one in its design phase had imagined a threat could come from so low. The patrol ships were out of position, and the deck crew was watching the wrong direction. Ironically, just as the Ukrainians had once relied on their own eyes to correct course, this time, so did the Russians. A deck lookout spotted the third drone at 300 meters. Too late. The FP-1's camera captured its final image. The bridge rooftop, where the main radar antennas were mounted. A 25 kilograms shaped charge slammed into the base of the radar mast. The explosion tore through the command deck in an instant. 144. 3R-381T antennas, capable of eavesdropping as far as Romania, were vaporized into molten metal. The computers storing 6 weeks of signals intelligence went up in flames. The mineral ME radar twisted violently, and secondary blasts surged through its circuitry. 18 hours later, when the last flames died out, the ship's radar section looked like a Salvador Dali painting, warped, melted, slumped by sheer heat. 6 weeks of signal logs, dozens of Ukrainian movement models, all gone. The very data that could have ended the drone war, erased. The ship might be towed back and repaired, but its electronic eyes and ears were permanently blind. Hours later, from different launch sites, new Ukrainian drones took flight, with new flight paths, new signals, new behavior patterns. Russian radar still fired back. They were still hitting the old launch coordinates. But now, what they struck were just empty fields. The data was gone. The game had reset, back to zero.